So today is World Tourism Day, and while there are signs the global tourism is starting to revive, the United Kingdom's decision to keep South Africa on the red list, which means a 10-day quarantine in a hotel at your own expense on return to the UK, is a very sore point. The United Kingdom is South Africa's biggest tourism market, and we are losing millions every day we stay on that list. Now, Lord Peter Hain, former Labour Party MP and anti-apartheid activist, has long been a supporter of South Africa. He has in recent days voiced his unhappiness with the decision from the UK government as well. And he joins us now from Wales. Lord Hain, thank you so much for your time this evening. You asked in a very pertinent tweet why Boris Johnson's government seems to have it in for South Africa, leaving us on the red list but removing Pakistan and Kenya, and then you attached that marvellous cartoon from Zapiro, playing, of course, with the Monty Python and John Cleese famous Silly Walk skit, but I mean, essentially suggesting that their decisions were as haphazard as a Silly Walk from the Monty Python team. What do you actually think is going on here? Do you suspect something sort of anti-South Africa, or do you just think it's like bad planning, bad organisation, lack of communication?
I think it's probably none of those specifically, but a casual disinterest of the kind that I'm afraid Boris Johnson has showed in his general diplomatic relations. And he should be looking at South Africa, given the historic relationships and close cultural tourism ties. More Britons, I think, visit South Africa for tourism than any other country in the world. So they're enormously close ties, and therefore South Africa shouldn't be given any favoured special status, but it should be looked at in a very sympathetic, careful, and considered way. And I don't think that's been done. The science, I heard your report earlier on, and I've been researching it myself. The science base of the British decision to keep South Africa on the red list seems to be based on out-of-date data, that that South Africa's beta variant is prevalent in the country, when, as I understand it, it's not.
Yeah.
It's the Indian Delta variant that's very rife in Britain and right across the world. And there are other factors here and anomalies which make it very hard for me to understand the rationale behind the British decision. For example, I and my wife have just come back from holiday in Spain. And Germany, France, the Netherlands, and so on, allows fully vaccinated South Africans to come to their countries without having to quarantine like you'd have to do traveling to Britain for 10 days in a hotel at the airport, costing you close to 2,000 British pounds. Well, you multiply that by 20, you get, how expensive it would be. And that's not just for South Africans wanting to visit, it's for British tourists wanting to go to them and enjoy the marvellous benefits of the country in terms of tourism or business. And they have to do that. So it's punitive. Why did Pakistan get lifted off? Why did Turkey get lifted off, which has a much higher infection rate? Why did Kenya get lifted off when South Africa has a testing and tracking regime much better than anybody else in Africa?
There's been quite a lot of talk over the weekend that our government failed to lobby as hard as countries such as Kenya and Pakistan, that we should have perhaps anticipated what you call this casual disinterest. The UK is a big player. Do you think it's fair that South Africa really is coming in for that criticism? Should our diplomats have actually been more aggressive in pushing for us to come off the red list?
I honestly don't know, Sally. I read that criticism. I have no means of judging it, whether it's opposition critiques or other motivations. I simply do not know. What I am clear about is that the British government must reassess this. It's got to look at the science on its own terms. It's got to talk to South African scientists. Maybe that's happening. I understand it could have been recently, but it's got to be proper professional scientific engagement, not a casual diplomatic disdain, which has just kept South Africa kept South Africa on the red list, which is a punitive red list and contains countries that have some of the highest rates of infection in the world. And three of the countries lifted the other Friday off the red list by Boris Johnson, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Turkey, have higher and rising rates of infection in comparison with South Africa.
You know how diplomacy works. There's also been calls that it's time for Cyril to phone Boris. Do you think that is what is required at this point?
Well, President Ramaphosa has a very high standing in Europe and America, and why he was invited to the G7 meeting in Britain a few months ago, uniquely of all African presidents. I think he has the ability to convey to Boris Johnson, who I'm sure would not refuse a telephone call, to convey the strength of South Africa's case. Not that there are no infections in South Africa, there are worrying levels. Not that there are no deaths from COVID, there are, but there are in Britain as well. Britain's rate of infection and deaths is still very high, and prior to the enormous program of vaccination, which South Africa is also pressing forward, and prior to that, Britain had the highest rate of infection in the world, bar America, bar the US. So we don't have anything to be high and mighty about. And if the criteria are fully double vaxxed and taking a test before you leave and then taking a test after you arrive, but not imposing this punitive, enormously costly and prohibitive hotel stay that the red list countries require, then I think we could be in for a constructive policy, which I think South Africa deserves.
As we're chatting, we've got a box up on our screen because the ANC is launching its election manifesto. In 5 weeks' time, we're going for municipal elections. You've been a political player, an anti-apartheid activist, and you've always championed for a democratic South Africa. Globally, though, do you see politics changing, perhaps as a result of this pandemic, how it's shaken all of us up across the world? Do you think that we're coming in for big changes in the political sphere across the globe? Or do you think it's going to be same old, ultimately?
Well, the evidence so far seems to be varied. There is a natural tendency at a time of crisis to huddle in support of the prevailing party in power because, they're the only ones able to combat, in this case, COVID, in other cases, war, for example. There's been that ability, but then on the other hand, Angela Merkel's party in Germany has, despite her popularity and long of the German equivalent of the presidency, despite that, her party's been defeated, though it's still competing for power in coalition. Boris Johnson's ratings are pretty high still, despite the incompetence with which he's handling, for example, the current the crisis of HGV drivers and petrol stations being closed, or long queues and gas prices and electricity prices going through the roof, and a lot of other problems which he's displayed enormous incompetence of. His ratings are quite high. As far as South Africa's elections are concerned, I think the big problem for the ANC is there's been far too much corruption, and I say that as a over the decades, I've supported the ANC's role under Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo in the freedom struggle and subsequently, and I'm a fan of President Ramaphosa. But the ANC's, I suspect, is going to take a bit of a beating because in the end, too many of its leading figures are mired in corruption, even now, and we've seen recent cases. They don't seem to have learnt the lesson that saw the downfall of former President Zuma, and the prosecutions that are now taking place. So I wouldn't be surprised if the ANC received a setback, partly because of lower voter turnout amongst ANC voters and maybe local factors. I think in the equivalent elections, I think they were, you can correct me, Sally, was it 2018 or 2017, South Africa, the DA and the EFF did takes cities that were previously
Yes, that's
ANC
right.
fiefdoms, like Nelson Mandela City. I don't know whether this will happen this time because the opposition lacks credibility as well. So South Africa has a pretty dysfunctional party political system at the moment, I'm afraid to say, because you need effective opposition to hold governments to account. We don't have effective opposition at the moment, and we have an ANC government which the rot set in under former President Zuma, and it's still there. And there's a lack of confidence in the ANC, quite understandably so.
Well, thank you so much for chatting to us this evening. Much appreciated. Author, activist, and former UK Labour Party MP, Lord Peter Hain, coming to us live from Wales this